There is a force of love moving through the universe. It's just fast. Whatever. Those words were penned by an amazing woman. Her name was Julian, and here's a little picture of Julian. She had a cat. She was a cat lady. So any cat ladies out there, or dudes, she lived of quite some time ago in the 1300s. Um, right around 1342 is when we think that she was born. And she came into the world that it wasn't a pleasant world to come into at the time. If you've heard of anything called the Black Death in England, the big plague that happened there between 1348 and 1350, it killed about 60% of the population of England. So it was a pretty big deal. It ravaged a lot of cities. And the city that Julian was from, Norwich, was one of the hardest hit cities ever. And it was like a major port city. And so the plague spread very rapidly there. And there was just lots of mass graves. Churches were overwhelmed with the amount of services they had to do. Priests were dying, and so they actually had to take untrained clergy to rush in to perform all the last rites and the funeral services for all of the people because so many things were happening. So many people were passing away, and entire families were disappearing within weeks. And Julian came into the world during this time. She was about, I don't know, 6 to 8 years old during the plague years. So this is a world she came into that was like recovering from trauma. She lived in a world where death remained very close, unpredictable, uncontrollable. You remember how scared we were during the pandemic when it was first happening? There was just a lot of fear. And I remember the first time I took off my mask in a public place after things had calmed down. And I wore my mask kind of well into things because of having immunocompromised people at my house. So I wore my mask in public places like Costco. Good Lord. Costco is like packed on Sundays. Don't ever go to Costco on Sunday. It's the worst. And when you're in a mask and you're in Costco and people are brushing up against you, like that sense of like, oh my God, do they have it? Am I going to get it from them? Am I going to bring it and carry it here to some of you or my family or friends? Like that whole sense of fear, that whole sense of dread, like imagine that, but multiplied and multiplied. Julian came into the world during that time. She experienced that as a young child, and it shaped her mind and it shaped her theology because that was a very forming time for her. And her theology was not one of naive optimism. It was actually forged in the fires of this difficult time during those plague years. Here's a statue of her. I really like that one. It's her book that she wrote. In May of 1373, at about 30 years old, Julian fell gravely ill. So ill, in fact, that a priest was called to come and administer her last rites. They thought she was a goner. And so they held the crucifix before her eyes. And during that time, she experienced a mystical experience. And she said that she saw 16 visions during that time when she was about to die. She called them showings. And she wrote a book about them because she didn't die. But these visions were of Christ and the whole passion, the sufferings of Christ, the love of God that was in Christ during the passion, and the nearness of God to all humans. And these weren't visions of Christ escaping from suffering, but they were of Christ coming to be close with us and experience our sufferings with us. They were of a God who is fully present in the midst of the sufferings. And so some of these visions that she saw where Christ bleeding and suffering on the cross. It was a very violent kind of a death. But in that, she saw the tenderness of God and the love of God and the nearness of this divine compassion to all of us. And she saw that the world was held together by love and not judgment. A lot of people during the Black Plague thought that the plague was God's punishment on humans for being so bad. And a lot of people still do that today. If there's a big natural disaster that hits a place, there are some Christian leaders out there who'll say, see, there's the judgment of God coming down upon the sinful people of that area. That's been happening a long time. People have been saying that. It happened during the plague times. And Julian, she had a radical theology come out of her experiences of suffering and the Black Death. This is a time when kings are sitting on thrones and it's a feudal system, and the kings have this ultimate power and authority, and the common person was just under their rule, and they didn't have a lot to say about that stuff. And when she saw the love of God being a display of the power of God instead of the wrath of God, when she saw that Christ was near to humans in our sufferings, she reflected on those visions and wrote a book called The Revelations of Divine Love. And this book that she wrote was actually the first known book in English written by a woman. It was really radical of her time. She was the first woman author to write a book in the English language that we know of. And so she recorded these things, wrote them down, and it's one of the classics today that I had to read for some of my schooling. She penned the words in that work of the prayer we just prayed. All shall be well, and all shall be well. And sometimes that's often misunderstood. The all shall be well prayer is kind of like, everything's going to be fine. Everything will be fine. But she penned those words that emerged directly from her theology and her visions of not denying the sufferings that we have to go through in this life, but how God was present within them and draws near to us in them. And I mean, she saw unspeakable things as a child, priests collapsing in the streets, neighbors vanishing, and families being broken, and social order fractured, economic uncertainty, all the things that come with a tragedy on that scale. She lived through it as a child, and then herself being stricken with sickness, being brought to that brink of death herself, seeing these visions, and then writing the words, all shall be well, and all shall be well, and all manner of things shall be well, not because everything's fine, because there's a force of love moving through the universe that holds us fast and never lets us go. That was radical theology in a time of kings and tyrants with all power in a feudal system. And they just believed that God must be like the kings that oversee us. And therefore, this Black Plague that comes down upon us must have been the wrath of God. And she instead penned the words of that prayer, all shall be well. In a world where death seemed to have this final word, Julian insists that love is actually deeper than death. And this is really profoundly Johannine, which is a word that means it's like the Gospel of John. It's a lot like that Gospel of John. There's her cat, by the way. If you see her cat, she's got a cat. This is a God who doesn't blame. This is a God who's not up there with a wagging finger looking down on humanity and saying, oh my gosh, you just keep screwing up. Even though we do. Like, that's undeniable, but God isn't up there judging every misstep we take. Now, one of Julian's most radical theological claims, especially in plague times where everyone is saying the wrath of God, the wrath of God, she said the word, when I saw my visions, I saw no wrath in God. That's pretty radical. Like, to say those words, to pen those words, I saw no wrath in God in those times. When plague was preached as God's punishment, Julian's visions offered a counter testimony to that. God does not stand over humanity with condemnation. God is not the architect of the sufferings we endure, and God does not withdraw in catastrophe. Instead, Julian sees God as tender, as near, as sorrowful with humanity, steadfastly loving us, accompanying us along our journey. And I think that resonates very deeply with John 1, when it said that the world did not know God and his own did not receive him. If God has not taken on flesh in the person of Jesus, then God couldn't be trusted in a world where flesh experiences suffering and hardship. And Julian insists that God is as close to us as our very breath. And God knows pain from the inside of it, not as an observer. And God remains with us even when others run away from us and walk away from us. God is always with us. This is the light making a home in darkness. And Julian teaches us that light doesn't require safe conditions in order to be the light. And God speaks not after the crisis, but from within the crisis itself and accompanies us through it. And God's love is not proven by preventing the sufferings of humans, but by remaining faithful within it. That was a big, big revelation that she had. Because sometimes when we experience a profound tragedy in our life, we have the natural question of why did God allow this to happen if God is all loving? And her theology says that love, the love of God, is not proven by preventing sufferings, but by accompanying us through them. And so this passage here that says the word becomes flesh and stays flesh and moves into the neighborhood, even when that flesh is fragile, she is putting like really solid words to this theology that comes from John 1:14. The word becomes flesh and dwells among us. This is why this is a Christmas themed passage, because one of the names of God is Emmanuel, which is God with us. And that's a very Christmas theme there. The words become flesh and dwelt among us, not over us. If you've ever tried to pray to that invisible man in the clouds and then be like, why don't you listen to me? Why aren't you like doing something? Why aren't you changing stuff? Why aren't you fixing things? That is a God that is above us. This word become flesh, this God becoming human, says that God is not above us, but among us. Not after us, but among us. God is even within us. And so God comes so close to accompany each one of us on our journeys. And this passage out of John is one of the most radical passages of the whole New Testament because it shapes most of the theology of the creeds about Christ. And there are two like really solid dogmas that you have to believe in order to take on the name Christian in classic creedal Christianity. We're covenantal and not creedal, but that's another thing. The two dogmas that really make someone really, really Christian according to all the creeds is you have to believe in a Trinitarian God, that God is one in three persons, which is really confusing. I don't understand it all. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, Creator, Redeemer, Spirit. And the other one is that you have to believe that God became human in the person of Jesus and was somehow fully God and fully human at the same time and lived among us. Like those are the two things that that all of the church fathers and mothers from the early period said, well, if we boil it down, that's it right there. And then how you approach those two dogmas make you a certain kind of Christian. Like you can be a Catholic Christian, right? And you can add doctrines to those dogmas that say, you know, we believe in prayers to the saints or prayers to Mary or different things like that, right? It doesn't make you not a Christian to believe those things or practice those things. It makes you a kind of Christian, a Catholic. And they have that doctrine. But you can't be a Baptist and pray to the saints because then that goes against Baptist doctrines, but it doesn't make you not a Christian. And a lot of the problems in fundamental Christianity today is dragging everything down into the dogma box and saying you have to believe everything that I do in the same way, or else you're not a part of the club. And what I love about Christianity is that it's broad. It has two things that we really hang on to. And then the way you approach those things make you a certain type of Christian. And amongst a covenantal group like us, that's not creedal but covenantal, we actually say that you have the freedom to interpret those things according to your own conscience. And there are people in this room that hold different beliefs than me. And I love that. Someone came up to me a couple weeks ago and they said, "You had a message a couple weeks ago. I gotta say, I disagreed with you." And it made me so happy. Like, I was like, it's working. We can have people amongst us. And I'm not like some person up here that just gets to dictate what everyone else has to think and believe and behave. Like, I deliver the gospel messages of Christ. You interpret them according to your conscience, and then you hold them in a way that's helpful for you and keeps you in loving community with all of us. It's really pretty cool. Now, this passage in John, it's one of my favorites, right? But it begs the question, why don't we see God when things go dark? Why is it natural to the human heart to say, well, where is God when we're in the midst of something really difficult? And John says some things in our passage that reveals how we miss the ever-present God in those times. And it's not a fault of the human heart, it's just a condition of the human heart. So he says that God was in the world and the world came into being through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to what was his own, and his own people did not accept him. But to all who received him, who believed in his name, he gave the power to become the children of God, who were born not of blood or of the will of the flesh or of the will of man, but of God, right? Now, the word world is often mistranslated as the sphere of influence that is in opposition to God, that kind of encircles the people who are not Christians. The people who are not Christians are of the world. And this sphere here that God is like in opposition to God is the world. And then we label behaviors inside that sphere that then prove that they are not of us. You know, in the 20s, it was people who drink, dance, and chew and go with girls that do. That was a rhyme that was taught to people in Sunday school. Maybe you have heard those phrases before or not. But that was a label we put on what we described as that sphere of influence called the world. When I was a teenager, it was like rated R movies and drinking and smoking and cussing. All those things. Like, you don't do those things because that makes you a part of this sphere. But if you do these things over here, like read your Bible and go to church and be really, really good and all those things, that proves that you're in a different sphere, the sphere of God's kingdom or God's creation. And that's the one that God is inside of, and the people who have faith in God are inside of that one. And they have these two spheres of influence, the world and then God's kingdom. And then we put labels on the things that describe how people behave in each one of those scenarios. But I believe that that's a false separation because it causes us to miss an important point. Because the people of faith, we live in both worlds. We have to exist in both worlds. There's a world and there is God's kingdom. And they seem to be in opposition with one another, but we dwell in both of those worlds at the same time. It is not an either or separation of who's in the club and who's not in the club. For instance, does anyone here use money? Anybody? Maybe a couple people use money, right? Did God invent money? God didn't invent money. Like, that's not a part of God's kingdom, but it's a part of the world and the powers of the world. But you can't survive in this world without it. Does that mean that all good Christians don't use money? That we'd all be dead if we didn't use money. That's how we get goods and services and food and medical care and all that kind of stuff, right? Like, that's a part of the world, the systems and structures. The world can be used to describe here instead the hierarchy of power that distributes our need that humans have overlaid on top of a God abundant creation. That's the world. The world is the things that we have overlaid on top of the creation that prove hierarchies of power and who gets to distribute those powers and how we have access to those powers. That's the world. It has nothing to do with rated R movies or not. or drinking and gambling and not. I played a lottery ticket yesterday and I won $50. I won bingo. We're playing bingo for family Christmas and I won 5 times. That's gambling. And then I got lottery tickets. I won $55 out of all my lottery tickets, right? But the very fundamentalist teenage version of me was that no, we don't do that because gambling is the thing in this sphere, and I don't do that because I live in this sphere. The world is not used to describe those behaviors. It's the systems of power that have overlaid on top of God's abundant creation that distribute the needs to the people. And it doesn't seem like we can organize ourselves without that. We have to live in both worlds. But every time we organize ourselves in power structures, the larger it gets, the more corrupt it gets. It's just the story of history. And it can be used to describe the world, can also be used to describe the physical world that God has made, the creation that we all live inside of, right? There is an abundance of how many acorns are in your yard in the fall, right? How many apples fall from the tree and rot, yeah, all around us, right? Like, but we still have to go to the store and buy apples, right? We don't have to buy acorns. We don't know what to do with those, but maybe if you're a good forager, you would. But how much of God's good creation falls to the ground and rots and goes to waste, right? Because God's creation is abundant. It just keeps flooding us with all of this good stuff. And then we have to build systems that distribute it. Like I don't have access to avocados in my yard, right? I have to rely on a plane or a boat that brings them to me so I can buy avocados and make some guacamole. Right? That's a part of the world though. But I did go to Guatemala. You know how expensive avocados are? And I'm walking around Guatemala and they're just all over. Like there's guacamole on the streets. It's so abundant. Right? There's just like there's avocados have fallen down and they splat all over the road. Like God's creation is abundant, more than enough, all over the place. And then we have to put, how we organize ourselves to then gather and distribute all that kind of stuff. It's even seen all the way back in the story of Joseph when he says, there's going to be a famine. So you better bring all the grain into one place. And then all the people will have to come to you to get that grain. And then you'll be able to buy their land from them. And then our empire will expand. It's the story of human history over and over and over again. I think the Bible calls it sin. And we label sin as those individual missteps that, are labeled like, well, drink, dance, chew, go with girls that do in the 20s. But you notice how our definitions of sin seem to change because somebody somewhere has said, no, that's okay now, but now this is the thing that we're not going to do. So it can't be that. The world is how we have organized ourselves to distribute the abundance of creation, and then the power structures that then organize themselves within it. So that's when it says that he was in the world and the world came into being through him, it's talking about physical creation. And yet the world didn't know him when he came into the world, didn't recognize him when he showed up, the very creator of the universe. And so we have these two different worlds in opposition to one another. The tragedy of God entering the world and the world not recognizing God is not because we are ignorant of God, but because we are estranged from the ways of God. The world is not neutral. It's a system that forgets its own source. Walter Brueggemann would name this as amnesia, creation forgetting its own story, its own narrative of where we came from. And John describes the cry of a world made by God, yet the structures that we overlaid on top of it reject God's presence within it, especially when it disrupts those power structures. And that was the story we looked at with King Herod last week. King Herod is trying to pursue Christ and kill him. So the failure to know God is a failure of attention and not intelligence because we're pretty smart individuals. But the light is already present with us. It's just unrecognized because it refuses to play the domination rules that are overlaid upon our creation. And then we mistake those domination rules for the fabric of that creation. And then when we're winning with those rules and abundance comes to us, God must be blessing us. And when we're losing according to those rules and we're experiencing scarcity, God must be rejecting us. You see this in some of the Christian theologies of name it and claim it and abundance and get rich and all this other stuff, which is really just capitalism cloaked in Christian theology. And again, we live inside of capitalism. We have to figure out how to function within it as the people of God, being faithful to God first and foremost. But we still got to eat. And so the Christian tradition has always been we're a small minority within a worldly power structure, and we need to figure out how do we live in both worlds at the same time and remain faithful to God. That's been the Christian predicament since its start. But the light is already here. The world is already in an abundant place. Blessings are everywhere, but we refuse to see it, or we can't see it because we're mistaking what we've overlaid on top, this whole fabric of reality, the power structures. We mistake that as God's action and God's blessing. And the people at the top that get to distribute the paychecks and the blessings and the different things, they must have a closer attention to God. God's ear a little bit more. And if I can get closer to that person, then I can get the blessings and they flow. And you see, we miss God in the moment because we're looking for God in the wrong places. God is within all of our lives already, abundantly there, but we're mistaking what is God and how God speaks. There's this divine vulnerability in the person of Christ. Julian saw this passage here as the pain of God's divine vulnerability, coming and making a home with us and risking rejection by coming home. God's greatest risk is proximity, coming close to us. Like if a stranger calls you an idiot, right, in traffic and flips you off, which might happen a couple times a week, right? It doesn't hurt that much. It makes you irritated and angry, right? You're like, what a jerk. Oh my gosh. Like you don't have proximity to the stranger. The person, the troll online that comments on your Facebook thing and it's just like, oh my gosh, they're being so like stupid. Like you don't have proximity to the internet troll or the person that flips you off and cuts you off, right? It doesn't hurt as much as if your child calls you a fool after you failed. Like that would be like crushing to the soul, right? Because why? Because of the proximity that they have to your heart and soul. This is the great fear of vulnerability that increases with proximity. The people that are closest to us have this ability to love us and hurt us at the same level. And that's scary. It's the scary part of love and vulnerability. And God risks that in this person of Jesus, shows up with as much proximity as God can in the very form of a human being and is then rejected. This is the message from John. It's not private salvation for everyone because this Christ figure will forgive everyone's individual sins, but it's a new way of belonging to God and to the people of God. John reminds us that this power is not domination, but dignity reclaimed. Perfect love gives us the power to live without fear. And receiving the light is consenting to a new way of being human. That one passage at the end there that says that, I'll bring it up again, says he gave power to become children of God who were born not of blood or the will of the flesh, but of the will, or nor of the will of man, but of God. Now think of that. Like this is bypassing that whole patriarchal power order of that day. Because how are things keeping going, right? Like people get married and then they have kids and then like that, right? And that's how you belong to the people of God back in those days, is you had to have the right parents and grandparents and ancestors. And if not, then you had to go through all these rites of passage to get into the club. And this is a new kind of belonging that God is just opening up, not those who were born of blood, but of God's very desire and God's will. Our evangelical brothers and sisters imagine this to be an individual conversion experience, which is a partial truth. We can all experience those things. But what John is doing here is bigger. It dismantles all claims to spiritual inheritance through race, status, or lineage. That was a radical thing to do at the time. It sounds very spiritual to us 2,000 years later after he wrote it, but it was a very socially radical thing to say at the time. That you don't have to be a certain race or status or education or economic status or lineage or any of that to be a part of the people of God. This was a very radical thing. It's liberation theology before the term even existed. Oscar Romero would preach this against the oligarchy that was controlling his country of El Salvador. And we looked at his character a couple weeks ago. James Cohen of our own country from the 60s, he would say that this is white supremacy embedded in his neighborhoods, keeping him from being able to own a home. So Teresa here, and she would say, this is something that is also inward. God is not inherited. God is encountered. That's radical because they would say, no, we're children of Abraham. Like we're good because we got great, great, great grandfathers that are a part of this thing. And John here is saying God isn't inherited through the will of men and bloodlines and all that kind of stuff. God is encountered in the creation that is around us. God breaks every closed system of belonging, even theological ones, and opens up this grand narrative for all people to engage in. I like what Thomas Merton said. He said, the world is full of God, but we are distracted. We get distracted. In short, he's claiming that God is not contained within the religious, economic, political, or philosophical systems that we overlay on top of God's good creation. We don't get to be the distributors of the blessing of a hierarchy that God has ordained. God has moved into the neighborhood and is as abundant as the very air we breathe. This is very radical theology that John is laying out in his time, and he does it with this use of poetry. The light is not absent. The world is distracted. So the next section says, the word becomes flesh and lives among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of as of a father's only son, full of grace and truth. One of John's most powerful claims that shaped most Christian theology of the early church. Basically, this says God moved into the neighborhood, right? Like the word became flesh, God moved into the neighborhood. This is where the gospel explodes. Walter Brueggemann is going to hear like certain language in here called tabernacle language. God like puts up a tent in the midst of this land of the desert where we're wandering around with God. Just like Moses was instructed to build a tabernacle in Exodus for the people to worship God, wherever their journeys would take them, they could take it down. Have you ever gone on one of those road trip camping trips where you like drive to another campsite and you put up your whole campsite, then you camp for a day and then you tear it down and then you move? That was how the people of God worshiped when they were in the desert in Exodus with Moses. And then as soon as they built a brick and mortar temple system, everything falls apart. They're like, we need a king and we need to establish religion and all these rules and regulations and how we do things. And like, God was like, no, we're actually on a camping trip together. This is fun. I'll show you where to go next, right? Like, we'll just tear down the tent and we'll go and move and then we'll put it up when we get there. And so just like Moses built that tabernacle in Exodus for the people to worship God wherever they might be in their journey, Jesus has made his holy tabernacle of God in the world in his very body. God chooses the human body to show up in the world in. God takes on flesh. God takes on oppressed flesh. God wasn't born as a Roman citizen. He didn't choose a cushy temple or a big, huge palace to be chosen. He chose a poor Middle Eastern family under the rule of the oppressive Herod within the power-hungry Roman Empire structure. He chose to come into the world that way. Think of that. Rejected all the power structures that we built to come in on the bottom end of all of society and build something from there. Amidst all the power struggles of folks trying to claw their way to the top, to live to at the next level of society and the next level, like politically, religiously, socially, all of those different schemings that we do, God does not rescue us from our flesh. God enters into the mess that we have made and redeems it from the inside with love. And James Cone says, when God shows up amongst the poor, the powerful don't recognize it. And one of the things that we have done in modern days is we've spiritualized everything All of our problems we turn into spiritual problems so that we can find spiritual solutions, and it doesn't seem to get any traction amongst our actual lived experience lives. Like, how does God encounter us in the world? Well, it doesn't matter because God has taken care of your spiritual sin, and now you're going to go to heaven when you die, so you're just good. Like, just coast. You're good. But I still have to live this human life in this world of power structures and all this other stuff. How do I be here? And it's not that the gospel isn't spiritual, it's both. We are both physical and spiritual beings. But what we've done is we've taken, here's the spiritual truths, here's the physical truths, and we've done this. We said, just focus on this stuff here. Who, yeah, like feeding the hungry and the poor and all that kind of stuff. Well, we'll get to that eventually. But it's really about this. And the gospel does both. One of the biggest revelations I've come to is that in the last 7 years, working with all of you, that's what I've learned the most being here. How modern Christians have just spiritualized all the theology of the text to speak to the ways that we have ordered the world to prop up the power structures that exist in the world that we created. And we've withdrawn ourselves from the conversations about loving the least of these. We've villainized the poor, and we've propped up wealth seeking as blessings from God who approves of our greed as human beings. And modern day Christian nationalism is the end result of that terrible theology. But I think that we need to embrace a Christian localism instead. A Christian localism says, let's become God in this neighborhood. Let's know our neighbors. Let's know the needs of the people, and let's embrace right here. Let's show up like God shows up into our lives. Let's show up into this community with all of the ways that we know that God is present with us, right? Because when God moves into the neighborhood changes. The neighborhood is affected. So my friend Dan White said, let's be done with Christian nationalism and get on board with Christian localism, deep presence, knowing your neighbor, contending with the common good of your community, caring for the environment around you, sharing meals regularly with those in your own community. That's what this passage says God has done with us. So why not us do that with our neighbors? God's light doesn't dominate the darkness. It enters it, risks vulnerability, and makes a home. That's how it works. So there's a couple of reflection questions for you to think about and a spiritual practice for you to try. Because God's not merely an idea. God is also your lived human experience. So here's a couple of things. What world shapes my loyalties more than Christ? What does it mean for God to dwell with me, not above me? Who has shown me embodied truth? And here's a practice to try this week. Take a slow walk in your neighborhood, even if you don't have many neighbors. You have squirrels, and they are your neighbors. Take a slow walk in your neighborhood, blessing the people, the plants, the animals, and the places that you pass by. To see what happens. See how that opens up your awareness to a different way of being with God in this world. Now, our benediction today is from a book called The Wisdom of Solomon, which is not in the Protestant Bible, but is in a different thing. But I really like this poem, so let me read it to you. Wisdom rescued a holy people and a pure generation from the grip of people who were crushing them. She entered the soul of a man who served the Lord. She has enabled him to oppose terrifying kings by means of signs and wonders. She rewarded the holy ones for their labors and led them along a wonderful route. She became a shelter for them by day and a flaming shower of stars by night. She carried them across the Red Sea and led them through the deep waters. She drowned their enemies and caused the depths to boil up over them. The people who did what was right then stripped the ungodly of their weapons. All together they sang hymns to your holy name, Lord. They praised your hand, which has defended and fought for them. Wisdom opens the mouths of those who can't speak and puts clear words on the tongues of infants. As the Wisdom of Solomon, chapter 10, verses 15 through 20. Amen.